So good afternoon, Harry. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So Harry Minas, and we've got David Lovegrove here in the studio who's helping me with the interview, and my name's Anya Tierney.
It might be worth just saying a few words, David, for your listeners about mental health in multicultural Australia,
Sure.
some of the background to it and what the organisation is about.
Great.
It's a project, it's a 3-year project which is funded by the Department of Health, the Commonwealth Department of Health. The management of the project is the responsibility of a consortium of agencies in Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide. And the main areas of work are around those issues which remain a concern as far as culturally and linguistically diverse communities, in focusing on immigrants and refugees. Issues that have been around for a long time, that have been tackled in various ways, but which remain concerns. And they're questions around the opportunities of immigrant and refugee communities to participate, for instance, in decision-making around policy, around service management, service design, and also evaluating the quality and effectiveness of services. I think Australia's made, remarkable progress in that open engagement, particularly of consumers and carriers, but also community organisations with a genuine interest in seeing improved mental health services. And although we're not where we want to be, there is still room for a lot of improvement in that engagement. I think the situation of immigrant and refugee communities is really far behind that in the general community. So if you look, for instance, at Peak and other consumer organisations or care organisations, the representation of people of refugee and immigrant background is pretty small.
That's spot on. And even here in Canberra, where Carers ACT has a number of support groups for people of diverse cultural background, there are not that many. I think there's only a couple of people who are CALD carers who are representatives who are now becoming more engaged in committees and specific, ACT Health Directorate committees where they can have a voice. So,
I think, Anya, the situation you described there really is pretty much the same around the country, and really requires a lot of attention, because if people from those backgrounds don't have an opportunity to contribute, then it's not possible to have a really good understanding about what the specific issues are for those communities. And so that it doesn't matter at what stage we're talking about, whether we're talking at the policy end or at the service delivery end, it means that neither policy nor service delivery is as informed as it should be by those perspectives.
Even to the extent that there are services there to deliver, and that's another big dimension of that as well.
And yes, it is. And I think, our mental health services are in crisis all around the country, the general mental health services. And I think one of the things that we need to remind ourselves of is when called communities are thought about, they're thought about as a minority, and consideration of called issues is sort of tacked on after the main decisions have been made.
Yes.
But we're not talking about a minority, because it's something like 40% of the population, which comprises people who are themselves born overseas or who have at least one parent. It's a very substantial proportion of the Australian population.
Indeed.
And I think there's a disjunction between, the sort of justified pride we feel at being a very diverse and multicultural and welcoming country and so on, and what we actually do about that to make our services responsive to the particular needs and preferences of the different subsections of our population. Now, what we're talking about here in relation to immigrants and refugees is also important for other subgroups of the population, but the focus of MEMA is specifically on immigrant and refugee communities. So issues of engagement, respectful, real, non-token engagement I think, at the centre of what needs to change, and one of the areas where MEMA is doing a lot of work. So MEMA has now established both consumer and carer advisory groups from across the country. We take those advisory groups as being absolutely central to the MEMA program, and the views of the advisory groups will be very influential in the further development of, I think, the MEMA project. And following on from that is what I think what you referred to, David, the issue of access to services. Are there services that are responsive? In general, the answer is no. And the more culturally distant individuals and families and communities are, the less capable services are of understanding what's happening to those individuals or families or communities, and the less capable they are of flexibly responding to the needs of those groups.
Yes.
We encourage people to get involved with MEMA. We need all the support we can get. We welcome people becoming members, registering, coming onto the website, and actually getting engaged in the conversation with us. There will be a blog, and there will be a much more interactive website than is the case at the moment. And we hope people will take an interest and get involved with us. I think, this is obviously a pretty long-term enterprise. MEMA, according to the current funding arrangements, is a 3-year project that comes to an end in the middle of 2014. I have a reasonable expectation that the Commonwealth will continue to support this kind of work beyond that time. But I think that it's important for the communities themselves to also be talking with us, but also talking with their state health departments and with the Commonwealth, saying this is a needed area of work. We have a national reference group, so that the members of that group will kind of link MEMA into each of the states and territories in a variety of ways. We have the National Consumer Group and the Carer Group, and they will do the same. So we're reliant on people kind of getting the message out.
Harry, I was going to say something, and I'm probably just being out there, but I've emerged from university last year, and one of my subjects was advocacy and inclusion, and we talked about the issue of the dominant culture and othering people who are different from ourselves or yourself. And do you feel that is a predominant issue that creates this cultural barrier for services and even policymakers in understanding that people who are coming here from other cultures aren't other? We are all, as you say, a diverse country. This country was established by people who immigrated here, so we are a multicultural community from the very start. So is it that lack of awareness and perhaps seeing people as somehow different from ourselves that creates the barriers in the first place in our thinking and in policy?
I think those issues are fundamental. If you look at our services, if you look at our policies, apart from the stray paragraph that refers to various groups, right, it would be difficult to understand that this is a multicultural society just by looking at how our services are designed, how they're structured, how they're delivered, the language in which they communicate, and so on and so on.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes.
The reality of both our policy frameworks and our on-the-ground delivery is as if this were a monocultural, monolingual society. The natural tendency is to focus on your own perspective and to kind of project that perspective as if it represents everything about the world.
Yes.
Yeah? And I think that's where I think we need politicians, policymakers, teachers, clinicians, but also those who run carer organisations and consumer organisations to say, hang on a minute, this really is a very diverse society. And if we're going to build the kind of country that we want this to be, then we have to not just kind of point to that fact, but allow it to influence how we think and how we act.
Yes.
And I think it's that point that there is a problem. It's now unthinkable for any policy document to be written or any service to think about what it does without thinking seriously about the kind of recovery perspective.
Yes.
Now, that's a kind of a conception and a movement that started in the consumer movement.
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
But it started in the consumer movement in the West,
Yes.
in the UK, in New Zealand, and in the USA primarily. That's become a very powerful kind of organising principle, and I think it's a very good example of how good ideas, regardless of where they come from, actually become very influential.
Yes.
And so I think psychiatrists now would not seriously talk about, what needs to be done or how services need to be organised without the recovery construct in mind. And I think it's that kind of change that we need. What we're looking for is, I don't think we should concern ourselves too much with, where the ideas come from. Are they from this or that group? But are the ideas good or not? I mean, this is, I think, the kind of the whole kind of recovery
Yes.
construct and movement
Yes.
is the best indication that it's just dumb not to include everybody in the thinking about what's the best way to go.
Yes.
Harry, are there any differences in how people of diverse cultural background view the concept of recovery?
There are, and I think that's an area for some pretty detailed research. We're going to be doing some work around that. If you look at the recovery construct, and particularly if you know the history as we were just discussing a moment ago, it's very much a Western construct. It focuses very much on Western preoccupations, which include issues like individualism, autonomy, responsibility, kind of, the right to take risks and to make mistakes and to learn from those, and so on. Now, some of those things are very deeply rooted in the Western tradition. And if you look at communities that take a somewhat different view of the kind of relationship between individuals and the collective, then those kinds of central tenets of the recovery construct as it's currently discussed don't sit that comfortably. Now, that doesn't mean that the notion of recovery is not important in those groups. It's absolutely important. But its shape might be a bit different.
Yes.
And the sort of order of priorities might be a little bit different. And who should be involved in making the decisions might be a bit different as well. So there's no doubt that one of the things that we need to do as the recovery framework becomes increasingly important is to examine how this will play out in the context of cultural diversity.
When we're talking about the issues of, this is a multicultural community, very diverse, as you say, with 40-something% of people either being born overseas or having parents who are born overseas. Why is there no data that's being provided to government so that there are, a greater awareness of the statistics? Is that one of the issues? Are we not collecting data the right way in the mental health and community sectors so that we can identify the issues?
I think you're absolutely right to point to the importance of information, data, evidence, and then how that's to be used in order to influence policy and practice. The quick answer to your question is no, we're not doing very well in this area, and I might just say a few words, if you'll allow me to, on that issue, because I think it's extremely important. MEMA was commissioned by the relatively newly established National Mental Health Commission to actually look at this issue of data.
Yes.
And we've written a rather long discussion paper that at some point it's expected that the Commission will publish and then will use in order to influence improving some of the kind of gaps that there are in the area of data. Let me give you some examples. We've done now 2 national mental health surveys. They are extremely influential because they are the main source of information about the distribution of mental health problems, mental disorders in the community, issues about service use, issues about how people look for information, the kind of impact of mental health problems in terms of employment, such as days out of role and so on. So those national mental health surveys are very important. But people who don't speak English were excluded from those surveys. So we have a situation there where those where you might expect might be among the more vulnerable in the community are not part of that data collection process.
Yes.
The implication of that, and it's a serious implication, is that what we know about the general community, we don't know about those non-English speaking communities, those who are unable to participate because they couldn't respond to these interviews in English. That's one example. If you look at a lot of the data which is collected by government-funded agencies, whether they're Commonwealth or state-funded agencies, the same issue applies. The variables that might be included might be things like which country somebody was born, and sometimes that's a reasonable indication of cultural issues, but often it's not. There is often very little other cultural information that's part of those data collections. So again, what we know about the general community, we don't know about these communities. And I think the practical implication of that is a very serious one, because as our knowledge about mental health and related issues in the community grows, the gap between what we know about the general community and these non-English speaking primarily or very culturally different communities just continues to widen.
Yes.
Because they're systematically excluded from these data collection processes. Now, in that paper that we prepared for the Commission, we've made a series of recommendations for bodies such as the National Health and Medical Research Council. It's possible, for instance, to put in a grant application that says we are going to do this piece of mental health research, but we're going to exclude non-English speakers because it's too expensive or it's too difficult or there are not validated instruments. Now, and many of those studies claim to be population representative, and they're not, because a significant proportion of the community is not represented in those studies. And I think it's inappropriate for government-funded, essentially, research to exclude significant portions of the population from the research. There are recommendations around what we might do in terms of improving the kind of capacity of researchers to be able to do high-quality cross-cultural research. So this is a major area which is a fundamental problem, because it means that we remain systematically ignorant about these communities. And so that when it comes to, government saying, well, give me the evidence that we should be focusing, we'll say, well, I'm sorry, but we don't have it. These groups are excluded from the kind of work which is funded and done. So it's a kind of a negative spiral.
Now, Harry, I know that MEMA is working on the framework for multicultural mental health 2003, 2008, and I think that was against the National Mental Health Standards,
yes.
And that MEMA is now working on developing a new document. What sort of documents will that be linked to, and how will that address some of these issues that we've been talking about in the community?
MEMA is working on this, and the material which is being developed is being linked very directly to the relevant standards. Now, the approach that's being taken is quite a different one, though. The initial document that was developed was a document. It was a policy implementation type document. The approach that's being taken by MEMA on this new framework is to develop what will be an online tool that service agencies can use themselves in order to rate themselves in relation to how well they're doing in providing services to the communities that we're talking about. There'll be 4 key areas in this tool, so that what agencies will be able to do is to go online and rate themselves on in a number of areas that will give them a very clear idea about how well they're doing, in the extent to which they are responsive to consumers, carers and families, and the extent to which they encourage and enable full participation by those individuals and groups. The second area is to do with safety and quality practices in mental health services. So how well do the kind of safety and quality frameworks and structures that are in place, how well do they translate to the multicultural communities? The third area is to do with mental health promotion, prevention, early intervention. So are the agencies doing good work in that area that is both relevant and meaningful to, and that reaches culturally and linguistically diverse communities? And the fourth area is around workforce. You know, what are the skills and capabilities of that agency's workforce in terms of being able to work effectively across the kind of cultural divide? So it's a different approach, and we think that it's an approach that will engage service agencies much more actively. Mm. It's a self-assessment instrument, so it's not like somebody looking over their shoulder. It's service agencies who want to improve the quality of what they do, being given a very clear guide about where they're doing reasonably okay, where they can improve, and what they need to do to improve.
Mm. I wanted to ask about the issue of accountability in terms of federal government and mental health standards and so on, and whether or not there's going to be, amendments to the national mental health standards that say that organisations should utilise these sorts of tools in order to ensure that they are actually addressing the needs of diverse groups within the community.
Well, I think it's a kind of a bootstrapping effort on you. You know, if you start off saying that, but the tools don't exist, then it's no use to anybody. Mm. It's a good idea to actually develop the tools and then move on to the next step, saying, well, here are the tools. The agencies now are able to make these self-assessment. We will now begin to include those assessments in the reporting arrangements that those agencies have to either state or Commonwealth governments. So what MEMA is doing is not going to fix things immediately and for all time. You will be surprised to hear. It's making some steps in a particular direction. And I think in the same way as we think it's important that consumers and carers need to be empowered, not by others, by themselves, in order to be able to fully participate. Mm. The same can be said for service agencies. I think a lot of them are pretty sick of the kind of regulatory environments in which they operate. And I think many of them, all of the service agencies that I've ever had anything to do with want to provide a high-quality service.
Yeah.
It's often a matter of they don't know how, they don't have the time, they've got too many urgent things going on, they don't have the people with the relevant expertise to actually develop these capabilities and so on. And so the kind of view that we're taking is that if we provide them with a very easy-to-use instrument that they can use for the purpose of improving the quality of what they do, then we would expect that most of them will actually take it up because they want to provide good quality services. And I think there are, it's with all this kind of stuff, it's always an issue about, well, do you push people in a particular direction or do you kind of attract them to a better way of doing things?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anya, David.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for the opportunity to just say a few things about the kind of work that Mima's doing. I hope it is of interest to people and that they will join us in it. The website is being redeveloped.